I'm Judy Singer. I'm the Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity, and I want to welcome you to this year's Talking About Teaching series. We have been having this series for a number of years now, sponsored by the Harvard Initiative on Learning and Teaching. So great thanks to our sponsors at HILT and our co-sponsors of the Bach Center, where we're partnering this year for the first time. And I think it's been a very fruitful partnership, and I look forward to additional partnerships over the coming years. As for some of you who were here last week, this will be a repeat. For some of you who were not able to be, it's 2 weeks ago, were not able to be here. This is a chance for faculty from across the university to have two sets of experiences. One is to be a student again, and I think to be a student again is about the best way to be pushing yourself in terms of your teaching, because the perspective taking that comes from being a learner is an invaluable experience. There's nothing like it to have yourself be not the expert up here, but rather the person who's learning. The second is to have a pan-university discussion about teaching, about how we teach, why we teach this way, how our students are similar, how our students are different, and how the kinds of ideas that we're going to be seeing today might work or might not work in the context of different schools, different ages of students, different degree programs that students are in, different disciplines. We've got a wide range represented across the room. Last week, 2 weeks ago rather, Kelly O'Neill from the History Department led us through a very active learning exercise about using images in teaching and curating and getting students to curate. And she used the example of the Ukraine and the crisis of the Ukraine. The next morning, there was this picture in the newspaper of the Ukraine, and I was thinking, for everybody who was here 2 weeks ago, where would it have gone? What was it telling me? I looked at it differently. I have read about the Ukraine differently since being in that class. And it's also been stimulating my thinking about how ideas about images could be used in other kinds of settings, even in a statistics class, where we do use images, but we don't typically use them in the kinds of way that Kelly is talking about. I'm going to stop here and introduce Lee Warren, formerly of the Bach Center, our co-sponsor, and formerly of Slate at the Kennedy School, who has been a champion for teaching and learning at Harvard for many, many years. Too many years. And I do have to say a pitch for our special speaker today, Marshall Ganz, who was a student in my class about X years ago, where X is a number. And that's all I'll say. Okay, so thank you. I'll turn it over to Lee. Thank you.
So I'm told I have to be behind the podium, which is an unnatural position for me. But before I introduce Marshall, I'd like to ask if anybody did anything different in their teaching this week as a result of what we did last time. Yes, what did you do?
I polled everywhere.
You did what?
Remember?
The poll?
Yeah, I did that in my national 20 class.
And it worked?
It was fantastic. We did it as part of a review for the midterm.
Oh, that's great. That's great. It's exciting. Did anybody else make any shifts or changes? Yeah, Rob.
So we changed in the lab sections how they tackled an experiment. Instead of explaining the method first, we started with the data, with the image of the data, and had them work it back up.
Cool. And did it work?
Yeah, I think so.
Go find out.
No, yeah.
You're asking the wrong person.
They enjoyed it. In terms of learning outcomes, Lee, you'll have to see.
Well, that's great. That's actually the purpose here is to learn get some new ideas about pedagogy and about teaching, and then see what we can use and what we can't use. Today we have wonderful Marshall Ganz, who is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School. He has a storied past, and he's going to do stories today. He was a Harvard undergraduate. He left before he graduated to go down to Mississippi and work on the summer project there, and then with SNCC, and then in '65 he went to work with Cesar Chavez for 16 years, I think, and he became a very accomplished, he says, union, political, and community organizer. He came back to Harvard finally in '91 and got his bachelor's degree and then a master's from the Kennedy School, and then he got a PhD in sociology in 2000, and that's where I met Marshall when he was a graduate student in sociology and he was beginning to teach. And he was wonderful then, and he just gets better and better. So he's going to show us something about storytelling. And in a new departure for our usual structure, he's going to build the debriefing in all along the way rather than have a separate section at the end of it. So, Marshall.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Is this working? Oh, good. It's working, yeah. So, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good, thank you. You know, there's the rhetoric of words and then there's a rhetoric of images. And just to be clear, there's a big gulf here between instructor and instructee. And authority seems to not be an issue here, right? It's very, very clear about that. Anyway, I wonder if we could just go very quickly, just say your name and what school or department. I'd like to have an idea of who I'm speaking with. Yeah.
I'm Elizabeth Noel. I'm Assistant Provost in the Office of Faculty Development and Diversity.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Mitchell. I'm in psychology.
I'm Sam Moulton from HILT.
Hi, Sam.
I'm Ito from Chinese Language Program.
Ivy Livingston from the Classics.
Sarah Jessup, Fox Center.
Soha Bayumi, History of Science.
Judy Singer, the Ed School.
Rose Goldman, Occupational and Environmental Medicine, Harvard Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health.
Great.
I'm Margie Zone from Expository Writing. Laura Hess from Gen Ed. Nicole Law from Psychology.
Everton Vargas Acosta from Romance Language and Literatures.
Todd Rakoff, Law School.
Erin Jarman, HILT and Provost Office.
Kitty Goldman, Ed School.
Caitlin Choi, STEM Cell and Regenerative Biology.
Caroline Light, Gender Studies.
John Stair, Fox Center.
Brooke Pulitzer, HILT. Sarah Shaughnessy, HILT.
John Jirash, Fox Center MCs.
Casey Orr, the Molecular and Cellular Biology Department.
Mark Mulligan, Graduate School of Design, Department of Architecture.
Rob Blue, Molecular and Cellular Biology in the Box Center.
I'm John Backumber. I'm in the Business School.
Allison Pingree, Kennedy School.
Lee Warren.
All right, good. Thank you. Thanks very much. No, it's just helpful to have a sense of. Oh, no, let's go.
Medical school.
All right, good. So, what is this too loud? Is this working okay? Yeah, all right. So I've been asked to share a bit of the pedagogy that I've been working with in teaching at the Kennedy School, and we'll focus on one particular piece. But let me put it in context a little bit. This is part of teaching on leadership and leadership practice as opposed to leadership theory. And I want to explain what I mean by leadership because as many people as teach it here have different definitions, so I want to share mine. Mine is rooted in 3 questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who when asked, how do I think of what to do in the world, responded with 3 questions. The first question was to ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Which isn't a selfish statement, but it is a self-regarding statement. If you presume to lead, then you better have some clarity about what you're about, what your values are, what you bring to it, and on what ground you stand. But the second question he said to ask yourself is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others in the world, and our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Which isn't really advice to jump off a bridge, I don't think, but is rather gets at the point that very often we cannot learn what we need to learn to achieve what we hope to achieve without actually beginning to achieve it. In other words, understanding flows from action, it doesn't precede it. It runs contrary to what Jane Addams used to talk. Jane Addams wrote about the snare of preparation, the danger of getting stuck in the snare of preparation. This counsel goes the opposite direction. Get into the action because then you'll create the conditions under which you can learn. And for me, leadership is about the interaction of those 3 elements, self, other, and action. And the fact that they're questions and not answers is also important. Because if you think about when is it that we say we need leadership? Is it when everything's working? Everything's fine, no problems? Is that when? When is it like, where's the leadership? Is it like, things are broken, things are contradictory, things are unclear, things are unexpected, the unpredictable happens to us. In fact, the domain of leadership is really not one of certainty, but uncertainty. And it's less about establishing control than it is about pursuing purpose in the face of uncertainty. In the face of uncertainty. And that's challenging and it's scary. I mean, because you ask yourself, do I have the skills to deal with these new challenges? That's a challenge to the hands. And can I use my resources in new ways to deal with these new challenges? That's a challenge to the head, a strategic challenge. And then there's the question, where do I get the courage? And where do I get the hope? And how do I inspire faith in others to take risks and deal with that uncertainty as well? And that's a challenge to the heart. So from my perspective, the work of leadership involves all three dimensions of hands, head, and heart, and needs to be engaged with in that way. And this is a way then of thinking about leadership as being more about learning than knowing. In other words, it's not the idea that the leader has all the answers, in quotes, but rather has some idea of the questions to be posed in order to find answers. So the definition I use is this, that it's about accepting leadership, which is accepting responsibility, which is a choice, to enable others. So this is not a diva theory of leadership. This is not leader as sun, and if you get close enough, you get warm. That's not the idea. It's leadership as a form of social interaction, enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. And in that sense, it's much more about practice than it is about position or person, although we're used to associating leadership with position of authority often, and then we're puzzled when often, I would say how often, those with authority seem not to be exercising leadership. Then again, we find throughout communities, at kitchen tables, in neighborhood stores, people exercising leadership with no formal authority. So the focus here is on practice. And the approach that I take in leadership it's about practice. It's about the practice of engaging others then in the work of developing a shared purpose. And because it involves both the head, the hands, and the heart dimension has to be taken seriously. Now, when I teach the full leadership program, we focus on 5 practices: building relationships, motivation through narrative, strategizing, action, and structuring as the conditions under which we can develop and exercise and practice leadership. Today we're going to focus on just one aspect of that, which is the challenge of the heart. And narrative, which is how we are able to mobilize the heart in order to enable our heads to guide our hands, is the way in which we're going to focus on that. And public narrative, which is a specific form of narrative we're going to focus on, is about how to use narrative to communicate to others why I'm called to what I'm called to. In other words, to get me. How I can use narrative to enable others to experience the values they share. In other words, how they can get each other. And a story of now. How to make real a challenge to those values that requires action. A source of hope for that action and a pathway to it. Now, the pedagogy that we'll use and use in all these practices, it's a little bit like learning to ride a bike. How many people have learned to ride a bike? And you learn by studying bicycleology, right? Or you saw a good video, great lecture, something on social media, right? What'd you have to do? How'd you learn to ride a bike? What's the first thing you had to do?
Get on the bike.
Yeah, and then what's the first thing that happened? All right, and that was the moment of truth. See, that's when you went home, went to bed, or you found the courage, because it takes courage to keep learning, to get back up on that bike, knowing you were going to continue to fall, because that's the only way you could begin to learn to keep your balance. And in my experience, that's how we learn practice. That is how we learn practice. Now, we may have some scaffolding. We may have some trainer wheels for a while, or some parents holding the back wheel, or something like that, and scaffolding is very important. But basically, there's no substitute for getting on the bike, falling, and learning from falling. And so it's important, kind of the attitude that we bring to this, and the understanding. And I'm a big fan of Carol Dweck's work on mindsets. And we take time with our students to have them read her whole chapter on that, about establishing a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset, so that failure is not understood as being as revealing truths about me as a person, but rather about what I still have left to learn as a learner. And creating the conditions under which that kind of learning can take place is critical for this kind of work. So the basic pedagogy that we'll see a little bit of today is first to explain, then to model, then to practice, and then to debrief. And we'll be working through all 4 of those aspects. Now, I just want to say this public narrative was certainly not something invented at the Kennedy School or even at Harvard, I hate to say. My first encounter with it is in, I think it's Exodus 8, where one of my sort of favorite organizers, Moses, who's an interesting character because he's a Jew who was an Egyptian. He was of the oppressed, raised in the house of the oppressor. And, you know, when he realizes that dual identity, it's sort of a problem for him. I mean, he goes out, he kills somebody, they chase him away. He's got to go off into the desert, which is where you go in the Bible when you need to figure stuff out. So he goes off to the desert, he finds a spouse, he finds an occupation, he finds a father-in-law, and one day he's walking along with his sheep, and he sees a glow off the side of the road. And he's a curious guy, so he steps off the road to see what this glow is, and it's this bush, and this bush is burning, and it's not consumed. And then he hears a voice, Moses, or Moses, we're not sure. There's some theological contention about that. You're called to free your people. And for those familiar with the text, what's the first thing he responds with?
Send my brother.
It's a little later. What's the first thing he responds with?
Probably no.
Why me? Why me? Why me? I'm not the guy. I can't even talk. I can't even give a speech in public, he says. And then second question, well, wait a second. Who are you? And who are these people? And couldn't this wait a little bit? And that's when God says, take your brother and staff and so forth, you can go. My point is that this framework, these questions of self, us, now, what's our relationship, they've been around for a long time. And I've yet to find a cultural context in which they're not asked. Different answers, but very common questions. Now, the starting point for diving into this narrative question, when I was working as an organizer, I was always interested in strategy very much because we were always David dealing with Goliath. I mean, we were always, and so when you don't have the resources, you have to be more resourceful. And so strategy is really very interesting. It's very creative. But there was another dimension that was always present, which was you could have a fine strategy, but what if nobody showed up? And that was the motivational dimension. That was the question of where's the courage come from? How do people develop solidarity? How is it they come to trust one another? So while I was interested in strategy, I was also very interested in motivation. And when I came back to school here, I discovered that sure enough, there had been some psychologists who had studied this question, in particular Jerome Bruner at school, who in his work on narrative talks about 2 different ways of knowing. One is based on the cognitive mapping that we do of the world, of where things are in relationship to each other, essential for finding our way, essential for answering the question, how, fundamentally about strategy. How do I accomplish something? But that doesn't help us answer the question, why do I care? Why does it matter? Why is this more important than that? That goes to the other kind of mapping, which is the affective mapping, the emotional value we attach to the things, people, and objects of the world around us. This is good, this inspires, this depresses, this frightens me. And it's that second domain of the meaning we attach to what is, which is where answers to the question about why reside. And that's the domain in which narrative developed. So you think about narrative working on the affective side and strategy on the cognitive side, both of them coming together in a form of strategic action. Now, sort of the premise here is that values, then, are not abstract intellectual ideas, but rather experienced. And they're emotional in content. And the values are emotional in content. And because of that, if we're going to take seriously questions of motivation or the relationship of values to action, we have to take seriously the content of emotion. What really moves us to act? Not what we think ought to, but really does. Emotion, motivation, the common root, that which moves us. And it's St. Augustine who wrote, it's one thing to know the good, he said, but quite another to love it. And loving it is what enables action upon it. So we're going to then go into the domain of emotion and explore the relationship of values and their emotional content or communication. Martha Nussbaum, in Unsettled Thoughts, reports on people with damaged amygdalas that experience little emotion but have the rest of the brain intact, and points out that they can reason options in answer to a problem until they're blue in the face, but you know what they can't do?
Choose.
Can't decide. Decisions rest on value judgments. Value judgments require emotional information. No emotional information about the world, what matters in it to me and to others. Very difficult to make decisions in reality. So this is how we're thinking of that. Now, we also know that some emotions facilitate mindful action. And I add the word mindful because we're talking here about agency, talking here about the capacity to choose action. Some emotions facilitate mindful action and others inhibit it. Most of the time we're operating on habit, right? I mean, most of the time we're on autopilot. And that's very efficient because don't have to learn how to drive the car all over again every time that I get in the car. It's very, very efficient. It's great. But it has certain limitations. I'm on autopilot driving along, and a truck pulls out in front, and I stay on autopilot, and boom, there are some limitations, some problems with that. So, of course, we've evolved a surveillance system in our brain that enables us, that detects anomaly, the unexpected. And so that truck translates in my brain, truck. And I get that as anxiety. And that anxiety that I feel turns out to be really beneficial because it breaks me out of habit, calls my attention, and gives me an opportunity to consider how to respond to a challenge. So the first sort of challenge that often people dealing with leadership face is how to break through habit in order to open people up to a fresh consideration of a different course of action, of different ways of thinking, of breaking outside those frames of habit that filter everything that we know so it conforms with what we already know. So that's one kind of challenge, is how to make challenge real, how to make the need for fresh action thinking real and experiential. Now, one way, urgency. People often use urgency, you know. So I got to make a life decision, but I got a problem set tomorrow morning. Which one will our students do? Of course, we know that. One of the big challenges, how to couple importance and urgency. Climate change movement has an enormous problem with that right now. How to take something terribly important, make it urgent enough that it can provoke the need for action. Anger is another one, and by anger I don't mean rage. I mean the dissonance we experience when we encounter the world as it is in contrast with the world as it ought to be in profound ways. We don't have to look too far for examples of that. Boko Haram in in Nigeria. In New Bedford, the INS shows up and takes a whole bunch of parents away, leaves kids stranded. Name your example. That kind of reaction to that dissonance turns out to be an enormously beneficial form of tension if it can move to action. So one challenge over here is to create challenge. That's number one, to deal with inertia and apathy, and these are a couple of ideas about how. Now, the other problem, though, is that we were very successful in creating a lot of anxiety. Terrific. What's our default response to that? What's a default response?
Run.
Yeah, something's coming at us. What are we going to do? You know the old thing, right? Fight, flight, or freeze, hope it doesn't notice us, and just goes on by, right? Now, that was no doubt very useful when it evolved. But once we started living with other people in broader communities and cultures, that kind of reaction, fear, sense of isolation, the kind of self-doubt, how can I handle it, turns out not to be so constructive. It turns out to be a ground of reaction as opposed to response. And so through culture, we've developed ways to turn reaction into response, to develop ways to respond to the challenge as opposed to react to the challenge. That is to find sources of hope to counter fear, sources of empathy or solidarity to counter isolation, and sources of ICMED. ICMED? Yeah? You can make a difference, also known as self-efficacy, but it is the real sense of efficacy. So then the question is, okay, if I'm in a leadership situation, on the one hand, I may need to create a lot of tension, but on the other hand, I've got to create some hope and some empathy and a sense of self-worth if people are going to respond to that tension or that challenge in mindful ways as opposed to reactive ways. Now, and let me just say one thing about hope. I'm not talking about flowers in May, what somebody calls hokey hope. You know, like everything's going to be okay, don't worry. I'm not talking about that. The best definition of hope I know is that developed by 12th century scholar Maimonides, who said hope, he says, belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, to be a realist is to recognize that the world is a place not only of probability, but also of possibility. Now, of course, our social science focuses on probability. People confronting leadership challenges often need to focus on possibility. You know, it's always probable that Goliath will win. Sometimes David does. It was highly improbable in 2007 that we would elect a black man president of this country. Highly improbable. It happened. That sense of possibility is precious in our own lives, in our own experiences, in the lives of our communities, as a place to go to nurture that sense of possibility to make real in the face of fear, which drives us in these other directions. Okay, so now, what's this got to do with narrative? Well, narratives all have three elements. They all have a plot, they all have a character, and they all have a moral. Now, what does it take to make a plot a plot? Got in my car at the Kennedy School, drove over here, parked in the garage where I was told to park, came here and began talking. Very exciting, right? You want to know what happened next? Make it a plot for me. What happened? Make it a plot.
I tripped as I was walking towards the library.
Okay, but what did I trip on?
Ooh.
What did I trip on?
Squirrel.
A squirrel. But this wasn't any ordinary squirrel, was it? No, this was a squirrel, the tail, it went on and on. Now wait, there were 10 others. Wait, was this the annual squirrel raid on Cambridge? What's the point? When does it get interesting? Even in such a silly way.
Conflict.
Conflict? The unexpected. Something happens that we didn't expect to have happen. That's when we lean forward and start paying attention. Up to that point, it's all boring. And so the real question to ask is why? What's in it for us? I mean, look, we spend billions of dollars on movies, plays. Basically, it's all like this. It's some version of what I just described. What's in it for us? Why do we care? Why?
Excitement.
Huh?
Excitement.
Excitement. Okay, there's a lot of places. Well, I always get excited.
What happened?
Why do you want to know? Who cares? Why do you want to know?
We want to see how a character reacts and how the resolution comes out.
What? So you'll be prepared next time you trip on a squirrel and it turns out to have a big long tail?
We use it as a way of understanding his decision-making process, his or her decision-making.
Oh, now I can tell I'm in Harvard and I'm getting that kind of an answer. And decision-making process in response to what?
In response to uncertainty that he feels with this new situation that he hadn't thought through.
See, think about this. The essential dimension of plot is what we're just talking about right now. And you say, well, why do we care so much about that? Why are we so interested in that? Well, how many times does the unexpected happen to us in a day? Little ways. You know, sold out of tickets at the movie theater, no seats in the restaurant. And then marriages break up, and we lose loved ones, and we lose jobs, and we're disappointed in so many ways that are unexpected. I think you can argue that one of the core dimensions of the experience of being a human being with this gift of consciousness that we have to remember and anticipate is having to deal with the unexpected, that for which we are not prepared, which by definition we can't be prepared, but nevertheless we have to deal with. And we seem infinitely curious to learn how to do that. Not so much the tactics of squirrels with big tails or whatever it might be, but what? Where do you get the courage? How do you keep us cool? How did she handle that? Does this make sense? So what's at the core, and because we can identify with the protagonist in a story, we don't just get like a moral like haste makes waste, we can enter into the experience. And now we understand mirror neurons. We understand now something about how that works, although it's been known for thousands of years that it works. We can experience something of the fear, something of the challenge, but also some of the hope and where it came from, and what values were drawn on, what resources were drawn on by that character in order to find some hope and some courage. That's what's happening. So the moral that a story teaches is not so much to the head as to the heart, because we've been there, we experience it. So, who'd you hear your first stories from?
Parents.
Yeah. Professional, full-time storytellers, right? It must have felt like it sometimes, yeah. What were they teaching you? Why were they telling you stories? Just to keep you busy, just to distract you? Huh? Maybe that. Huh?
Or get us to go to sleep.
Yeah, I mean, Bruner talks about training in agency is the way he describes it, like preparation to be choiceful human beings, right? You know the stories about, there was Uncle Charlie, and Uncle Charlie, he started out right, but then he took that wrong turn. And you don't want to be like him, but, Aunt Harriet over here, she had it right. And all families are loaded with those stories. Any faith tradition, you go, what do you hear when you go to synagogue or mosque or church? You hear stories. You hear stories about how to choose, about how to deal with hopelessness, about how to deal with despair, about where to find hope, about how to experience solidarity. That's what cultures all teach through, is their stories. And so stories are one way in which we learn to exercise agency, one way we learn to mobilize the emotional resources to be able to respond as opposed to react. And public narrative then is a way of trying to harness that power to the work of leadership by first using narrative to communicate to others something about what's moved me to be here. Where's my moral authority come from? Not my resume, I'm not talking about my resume or my titles, but me. And then how to use narrative to bring alive values they share. And then the challenge to those values that requires action. So we're going to look at a short video right now, 5 minutes, of one of my students from 2 years ago, in the public narrative class, which goes in 2 modules. We just finished the first module. Students record a 5-minute public narrative. Now, they've been working throughout the 5-6 weeks preceding. We had an all-day workshop with them in which we introduced self, us, now, and linking, which is putting it all together in the way that I'm doing right now. And then a week on self, a week on us, a week on now, and then linking it all together. And so then at the end they do a 5-minute video. They present to their others in their section. Because I teach this class with 7 teaching fellows, we have like 1 teaching fellow for about every 18 students, about 130 students. And the interesting thing is they're from, I think we have now about from 31 countries. So, and we design within each section teams of 4 that work together to coach one another through that whole process. We have a little program called Grumbler that maximizes diversity. You can, it's beautiful. It saves a lot of cards on the floor and that kind of thing. It's like, because we have different countries, we have genders, we have races, we have the whole thing, and we want to maximize the different particularities for this kind of learning. And I think you'll get a sense why in a moment. So this was one video. James Croft was a student who taught with me again last year at the Ed School. He did his PhD in education. So now take a look at this and see if you can identify when he's telling a story of now Remember, story of now is the challenge, the hope, the choice. When he's telling a story of us, of self, why, getting him, and then when he's telling a story of us. And the tests are pretty easy. If you feel motivated to go sign up, then the now works. If you feel part of an us, then the us works. If you think you get him, then the now works. That's sort of the test. So let's take, who's going to, oh, I'm supposed to do this. Okay. The other thing, two other things I want to mention is that, remember, stories are constructed around choice points. See, a story is a moment. It is not a whole series of things. It is a moment in time. It is an episode. It is an event in which a challenge confronts a protagonist. There is a response, a choice, and then there is an outcome. So see if you can identify the choice points. Pay attention to the details, because storytelling is also highly visual in the way it works. Details. And then see if you can experience the values that are being lifted up through the stories that are being told. Now let's take a look.
Wow, that works. That's amazing. 6.12 seconds. That's about how long it takes to fall 604 feet. And 604 feet is about how far Tyler Clementi fell after he jumped off the George Washington Bridge. Now, as we know, he took his own life because live video footage of him having a romantic encounter with another man was streamed live on the internet by his college roommate. Just one of a very long list of young people who have taken their lives because of anti-LGBT bullying in the past few weeks. Now, I never experienced anything like what Tyler went through when I was at school, but I was bullied for being gay. You see, when I was a kid, I was a ballet dancer. And every week I squeezed into a leotard and blue shiny hot pants. It was quite an outfit. And I spent an evening practicing demi-pieds and pirouettes. And I loved it. I loved the discipline. The music played on the old piano, the feel of the wood beneath my feet. I even secretly quite liked the outfit. But my schoolmates and some of my teachers didn't like ballet as much as I did. And one of my teachers, a PE teacher, used to make fun of me. He used to say how girly I was, how dancing is not something that boys should do. I remember the sneer on his face as I walked past, and I remember that he was the first person to call me a fag, which at 7 years old, I didn't really understand. I remember in high school how gay was only ever used as a term of abuse. And I remember one cold morning sitting in assembly while the principal intoned, "Homosexuals deserve our pity and our prayers." And I sat among hundreds of other boys thinking I was all alone in the world and that I was the only one who had this problem. Now, not everyone may have experienced something like that, but we all know, I think, what it means to feel alone, to feel like there's no one on our side. Perhaps you were too tall and the short kids made fun of you. Or perhaps you were too short and you got it from the taller ones. Or perhaps you were too smart or too dumb, or from the wrong side of town, or the wrong race. We all know, I think, even if just for a moment, what it feels like to think that there's no one on your side, to think that no one has your back. And all of us, if there are young people in our lives that we care about, can agree that we don't want this to happen to them. Imagine, if you can, what it must be like to come home and see a strange shape hanging from a tree in your backyard, twisting in the wind, the creak of the branch as it bends beneath the weight, and that feeling in your gut as you get closer and you realize what it is hanging there, who it is, who it was. Because that was Seth Walsh, 13, who hung himself from a tree in his backyard. It was Billy Lucas who hung himself at his grandmother's house. And it was Raymond Chase who hung himself in his dorm. And it could have been your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter, or your friend. It could have been one of us. So I know, I only came out in March this year, after 10 years after I first told my parents that I thought I was gay. And in those 10 years, I lost a lot of opportunities to make a difference. I was a high school teacher, and every day I wasn't out was a day I deprived the gay student of a positive role model. And I'm not willing to waste any more time. I have to act now. We have to act now. Because it isn't enough to let these things happen and then mourn them afterwards. We need to catch these kids before they jump. And there is something we can do to help as a start. Journalist Dan Savage has started a campaign, the It Gets Better campaign, to send messages of hope to teenagers who are being bullied because they're gay or for whatever reason, that they should have hope for their future, that they do have something to live for. And I think that if we made such a video, as Harvard students with glittering careers ahead of us and sparkling degrees, then we could make a difference. So we need people to hold a camera, to share their stories, to do editing and sound, to stand in a big group and say it gets better. No contribution is too small. And if you want to get involved and you're an undergraduate, talk to Tevin here. Do you mind waving?
Oh, hi.
And he'll tell you how to get involved. And if you're a graduate student, or if you just want to come along, from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Elliott Lyman Room in Longfellow Hall at the Education Schools campus, stand up and say, we're standing with these kids. We've got your back. Let's catch them before they jump. Thank you.
What did he begin with? When he began, was it a story of now, a story of us, a story of self? Really?
The guy jumping down. The person jumped off of the Tyler.
Yeah. Pretty explicit image, right? Pretty clear. Okay, so he begins with the now. And then where does he go?
Self.
What connected with you in the self? When did you start to get him in the self part, that first self part?
Leotard.
Huh?
The leotards.
Why?
They're concrete. The blue satin shorts, the floor.
What did you sense about him via that? By his bringing that alive? By his bringing alive about how the ballet and the colors and the sound, what did you get about this person?
He's a real person.
Real person, what else? Huh?
Well, he has a heart.
Do you feel some joy in this?
Yeah.
The way he's recalling this, there's some joy in the dance and in the color. And this is not like a cutout. There's some reality to this person. What else did you get about?
He's not just the person you see right there.
Yeah.
He has a history.
What else connected with you in this part about himself?
He's great.
How did you get that?
The fact that he was telling a story about something that had hurt him when he was hurt him. He felt afraid then, and now he's ran, and then he persevered.
Interesting. So you mean vulnerability isn't something we cover up in order to show how great leaders we are, that we have no flaws, that we've had no struggles? Turns out that maybe the opposite might be true. In fact, maybe the foundation for our claiming anything that we would have to teach at all is the fact that we had to deal with problems that were real and that were struggles. Interesting. What else? What else connected with you? Where you felt an emotional response about him?
You showed his vulnerability in how he didn't step up or come out.
I'm going to come to that. I want to come to that, and I want to stay with just that first part. Was there anything else?
When he was 7.
Yeah.
And being alone in a room full of people or other kids.
How did it make you feel when he was doing it?
It made me remember all the time.
Were you too smart, too dumb, too... Okay. So then he moves from a self to what? How does he make... Well, let me just ask you. Did you feel part of that us? Were you drawn into that us?
He changed pronouns. He went from I to we.
Yeah, but what made the us connect?
Well, he talked about feelings of other. He went from the specific of his, feel in his clothes as a 7-year-old to people feeling other for whatever reason.
Anybody in this room ever feel othered? I mean, really, it's kind of like I asked my class, anybody in the class have any experiences of loss, pain, hurt? Anybody got experiences of hope? Well, guess what? I mean, if you didn't have hurt, you wouldn't think the world needed changing. And if you didn't have hope, you wouldn't think you could. And we have these repertoires of experience to draw. And when someone tells a story, it draws out our own stories of moments. And that's where the meaning is created, at that intersection. What else did you feel in us? That this was not, that this included you? Yeah.
When he was talking about your people you care about could be swinging from that branch.
Could be your brother, your sister. Could be one of us. Then where does he go? Does he go directly there?
That's when he says he didn't act.
Ah, how about that? Now we're going back to the self. And we're going back to the self for what?
Connected with us.
You have to connect with us about what?
Fear.
Yeah, and what else? How many, huh?
About not acting.
About not acting. Have you ever thought back on that time you were supposed to act and you didn't? Anybody? Vulnerability once again. Except, where's the hope?
You can change.
And where's the evidence of that? Right there. Right there. God's talking to us. That's the evidence right there. There's a little hope in that. Is there a pathway to action? You know where the Elliott Lyman room is at the ed school? Do you see how this works? What else did you see in this? See, sometimes I show the first 7 minutes of Obama's talk to the Democratic Convention in 2004, where he introduced himself. He goes, self, us, now. It's a very direct, linear presentation. Go look at it. You can see how it works. This is interesting, first of all, because it's not Obama. and I mean, you know, people say, well, I'm not Obama, you know. It's like, but the second thing is that he starts with a now, he moves to a self, he moves then to an us, back to a self, back. So it's not a formula, but it is a framework of the elements. I think that the fundamental components of agency, which is self, relationship to other, and relationship to purpose. And those three dimensions are present throughout. What else did you see in this? What else connected with you? Yeah.
It's very subtle, and I don't know exactly if it would map exactly onto the three components you're talking about, but in connection with the image of seeing the boy hanging, he said you begin to realize what it is, who it is. So the shift from object to agent, or object to human,
yes,
and who it was.
Yeah, it's very.
And so then you realize the present goes to the past tense, and you realize the loss.
Yeah.
So you go into a humanizing moment, and then there's a moment of loss.
Object is turned into human being, into loss. Oh, it's a great observation. You always see kind of new things here, right? What about that image? That image, is that an image familiar to us in this country? Lynching?
Yep.
You know the Billie Holiday song, Southern Tree? What, strange fruit, southern trees, bear a strange fruit, blood at the leaf, blood at the root, black body swing in the southern breeze, scent of magnolia in the poplar trees. That's a narrative that goes far beyond this narrative. But it's an injustice narrative that he brings right into it, without even saying it. Through the image, those other narratives, because one narrative, it weaves into other stories. It brings in other stories that are out there, parts of our culture, history, people's backgrounds, and he does that very, very skillfully here. So this is sort of an illustration of the kind of thing. And yeah.
I think I got distracted by the story. He took your class before doing this.
Yeah, this was his final.
This was his final.
Yeah. He did okay.
Already passed.
Yeah. No, but I want to tell a story about it. He was working the whole time on a different story. On something he thought he ought to talk about. And this was just needling him. And 2 days before he did this, he said, "Screw it." Sorry, I shouldn't say that. No, he said, "No, I got to do it." And he put it together like in 2 days. But really, he'd been putting it together for 6 weeks. It's one of those things where you work on it. At the ed school, we do this exercise for the EDLD cohort, the 25 students that come in to do the 3-year doctorate in practice of educational leadership. The first thing we really do in welcoming them is a full one-day narrative, a workshop in public narrative. Then they go home, and the next day they come back and here 15 in the morning, 10 in the afternoon. It's 25 in the cohort. And the improvement from one day to the next is just remarkable. Because it's an iterative kind of process. It's like this is the first time on the bike, and you start working on this stuff, and you start developing it, and it calls up memories, and then people go home I had some students say, well, now I was on the phone with my mother, I can't tell you how many times, asking, well, why did I do that? When did what really happen? So it's an invitation to a process, and I guess the other thing I want to say about this, it's not a script, it is a process. It is a way of translating, a way of processing emotional information about purpose and action, I think. It's not a script. And people think, oh, now I'm going to tell my public narrative. No, it's a constantly evolving, because what's relevant in yourself to who you're with at particular time, it's going to change. But it's more a way of learning a kind of tool that can be used for this. And Judy, you know, I'm curious about why you care so much about this stuff.
Which stuff?
This learning to teach and teaching itself. When I was in your class, you were a great teacher.
Well, that's why I care about it.
Yeah, but why? Why is it important to you?
I can give you the emotional answer. My mother was a middle school math teacher.
Yeah, but sometimes that makes people go the other direction.
It did. I didn't want to be a middle school math teacher.
Yeah, so what happened?
Fancy middle school math teacher. I'm a very fancy middle school math teacher.
No.
I didn't want to do what my mother did.
Where did you grow up? I don't really know that. In Brooklyn?
Can't you tell?
What did your folks do? I mean, I know you were your mom, but what was your father?
He was a CPA.
CPA? Oh, so the math, you had a lot of
I
math.
grew up with math, but I didn't want to be a CPA, and I didn't want to be a math teacher.
And you went to public high school, Brooklyn?
Public high school, public college.
Which college?
SUNY Albany.
And what were you studying there? Did you go right into math?
I was a math major, and I didn't want to go be an accountant. Oh, I'll do the whole narrative. I actually can do this. I came home my freshman year of college, and my parents said, this is 1973. My parents said, what are you going to major in? And I said, math. And they said, well, what are you going to do with that? Which in 1973 was sort of enlightened for parents of a young girl. And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, you have to do something practical. So my father said I should become an accountant, and my mother said I'd become a math teacher. Think outside the box. So I went back to college, and I took one accounting class and one education class. I was one of 3 girls in the accounting class. We all sat right under the professor, who looked at the 3 girls. That's the way I sat in my calculus class too, where there were 4 girls. 3 girls sit under the professor, and I was 17 years old, so calling myself a girl is not unreasonable to her. And he looked at us, and I can still remember, I'm Doc Cannon, and he looked at us and he said, you 3, what are you doing in this class? You're taking up the space of a man. And
Who said that?
okay. And to me, that was like putting a red flag up and saying, I am going to ace this class, which I did. I held my hand up every single question, and I've never taken another accounting class. I took an education class that was reading Crisis in the Classroom, and Summer Hills was the particular area. It was actually a terrible class. And I decided I wasn't interested in education. So for those who obviously don't know me, I'm a professor of education, statistics of education. And so I knew I didn't want to do either of those things. And I found statistics. I had professors who took me aside, and I applied to a number of graduate schools, including Harvard, and that's the narrative.
But when did you discover the teaching thing? Because obviously not in an education class. Because I get the spirit of, by God, I'm going to do it.
But what? The teaching thing. My advisor was actually a fabulous teacher, Frank Mostel. He was one of the distinguished teachers of statistics at Harvard. And statistics is so poorly taught.
Yeah, except for a few classes.
My motivation was, I'm going to be the great communicator of statistics. That's actually the mission.
Is to preach statistics.
Right. Now it's to preach some other things, but that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you.
How'd I do?
How'd you do? I mean, did you learn anything you didn't know?
Yeah.
About what Judy's been doing, what she's doing? Now we could go to Provost. That's a whole other story. That's all. Yeah. No, but so what was I doing just then? I didn't have to work that hard. She didn't make me work very hard, but what was I trying to do?
Listen,
Huh?
listen,
And what else?
get the story.
Get the word.
Yeah, and how? What was I doing?
You were trying to get a narrative.
Yeah, how?
I would say by not
What kind of-
not taking the easy answer,
Yeah.
not being satisfied with the surface answer.
Yeah,
And asking for personal history.
personal history, but this is really key. It's kind of like, oh, and so then I was just always going to be a math teacher. But you came out of the womb with an abacus or something. No, see, so problematizing choices is a really important part of this because we naturalize our choices, right?
But Marshall, how did you decide to go deep on the teacher part? You could have gone deep on something else. You probed around about the teaching, all about the teaching.
I think because I wanted to, I think that she really cares about teaching. That's why we're here. I had that direct experience. And it was math teacher or statistics, and I wanted to get the calling part. See, it's much more
Actually,
about...
I push you on that. I think you did that because of the audience. One of the questions I have...
Because of the audience?
...is about the audience. So he could have chosen, because I'm actually sitting here thinking about how do I get the faculty to change, which is like another whole...
We can have another...
I'm thinking about, right? It's a longer conversation. But... So tell me about the audience, and what he did is he identified a characteristic we all share.
No, I wasn't actually doing... No, it happened that way.
Oh.
No, it happened that way, but no, just to... No, I was trying to get where this sense of calling came, especially in other related calling. And that's where the teaching comes in. No, it could have been, studying rocks. It goes in the same kind of direction.
Subconsciously you did it.
Well, maybe. I can't speak to subconscious.
Because everybody was sitting here listening to me,
Yeah,
but
but were
also
they...
thinking about...
Yeah, but let me ask you something. Was it the reason that you were sitting listening to her, was it all just because about teaching? Or were you curious about her? See, we're really curious about other people. And to have people actually curious about us, that doesn't happen that much, right? And it's kind of a little scary, but it also can be kind of very invigorating. And see, this problematizing choices, so everybody from your school did that, but you did that, well, why? The point is to recover those junctures along the way, because when you get a choice, what's it evidence of? What is a choice to do this as opposed to that evidence of?
Values.
Of values. And so there's values there underneath that. And so if you're trying to get at a sense of values, you go and probe a lot about choice points and directions not taken. You problematize others. See, we teach in the class, we teach how to tell your story, but we teach how to coach other people's stories. They go together. They go together. And so the students that come out of the class, they know how to coach and they know how to tell. Because there's a Yiddish riddle, who discovered water? Anybody know?
Not a fish.
Ooh, there's somebody got it. All right. That's about the first time anybody's ever gotten that. Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, I don't know, but it wasn't a fish. And the point is that we are all fish in the water of our own stories. And so we really need interlocutors in order to get at this. This is not something you do sitting in the computer or talking in the mirror. You work with somebody. Because the question of whether it works or not is only evident in the other person's experience of it. So it's inherently a social, interactive kind of dynamic. But what that means is that we can get really good at it with just one other person coaching. And a good coach, asking good questions and probing and asking the whys. And so philosophically, the ground for this work is the work of Charles Taylor, the moral philosopher, was Michael Sandel's teacher who taught his work in communitarianism and sort of the notion of the significance of community and community narratives in constructing our moral identities. And so there's kind of some psychological foundations, but the philosophical stuff, and what Taylor writes about is the importance of being able to articulate our moral sources. That's a lot of what this is. It's articulation of moral sources, not as a philosophical disquisition, but experientially. so that other people can actually sense, oh, I get it. I get why you're doing this. I get why you care about this. You see how this works? So now, you're going to get a chance, and we're going to ask you to, you have a little booklet here, and this little narrative guide, if you turn to the very last pages, page 10 and page 11. We're going to ask you in just a few minutes to turn to the person next to you. And first, you're going to have 5 minutes right now to just reflect. And this is a little guide here. Any change you want to make in the world? Well, maybe not. What kind of values do you think? But the real focus here is, why are you called to do what you're doing? And see, students, what I find is that we often confuse career and calling. At least a lot of my students, they want to know, they're trying to figure out their calling. And we give them a lot of information about career. And I think it's backwards. And so this is the question we're asking here is, why are you called to do what you're doing? And calling is kind of a provocative, sort of sounds religious, but you get the meaning, something, you're doing it because you want to do it. Why? Why does it hold such value for you? What story can you tell about that? And see, this isn't the idea that there was one epiphany and everything. Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes there's a whole series of events. But think about, if you want to communicate to another person something about why you've been called to what you're doing, what story could you share? What story could you tell? And very often they're stories of challenge, but then there are also stories of hope, and often they're stories of both. So, 5 minutes to think about this. And then comes the interesting part. You'll have 2 minutes in which to tell that story to the other person. 2 minutes, timed. And then there'll be 3 minutes for feedback. Here's what I got, here's what I wanted to know, here's what connected, and then you'll flip, okay? And then we'll debrief it afterwards, and I'll let you know the times. And so 5 minutes of reflection begins right now.
Only one story?
Okay, so you're going to have 2 minutes. I'm going to let you know when the 2 minutes are up. And then there'll be 3 minutes for feedback. What connected with me? In what I heard, what connected with me? What did I want to know more about? What did I want to know more about? Give that kind of feedback to your partner. And
we're just telling the story in the last box. We're not telling them how we got to it.
you may want to reference. You may want to have like a sentence for just to contextualize it with real juice in the last one. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, you may want to say something. Well, here's the thing, but really want to get at the story. And remember, story is a moment. It's an event. It's something that actually happened.
You're supposed to ask questions of the other person?
After you listen for 2 minutes, and you listen very closely, and then you give feedback. You have 3 minutes. You can, in the feedback, you can give them feedback, what connected, what more you wanted to know. You can ask some further questions. You can use the 3 minutes in that way. But the idea is to coach the other person, help the other person improve. That's kind of the idea, by communicating what you got from what you heard.
So is it just about the personal story that we share at the end, or the entire narrative?
Just the story that you tell. All right. I'm going to give a go here. You're already starting. All right. 2 minutes officially starts now. Okay. Go. Okay, that's time. Stop. Time. All right. 3 minutes of feedback, starting right now.
You started with a story that was outside.
Okay, next person. 2 minutes. Other person, 2 minutes, starting now. Let's go. Okay, that's time. Time's up. Time's up. Hello. 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 Time's up. You found this pretty boring, I guess, huh? All right. First question. Hello. You can have coffee later. Yeah, no, it's good. It's just beginning. What kind of feedback was most helpful? What kind of feedback? What kinds of questions? What kinds of feedback was most helpful to you from your partner?
So the importance of
Yeah, go ahead.
of making sure that there's a personal anecdote, a hook, an expression of self that is unvarnished and not a kind of a conceptual picture.
How did you get that feedback? I mean, did he tell you that?
Yes, we gave it to each other. We were saying yes.
No, I know. Yeah. What else? Back there?
When Sarah identified an us moment in my narrative that I didn't even realize was an us moment.
Huh. What kind of us movement was it?
It was just a shared experience. I guess it was a vulnerability moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. There is often a process of discovery here. Real discovery. Fresh ears actually paying attention to us. Think of that. Without trying to get something, but actually help us. It's not an everyday kind of experience. What else? What else? What other kinds of feedback? Yeah.
I liked it when Todd said, I wanted to ask you questions when we said this. Yeah.
That's good. Oh, yeah, let me think more about that, right?
Actually, you did the same to me. You said, this is
Yeah, that can be very helpful. Simple things like that. What else? What other kinds of feedback was most helpful? Yeah?
One of the things that we just realized was funny was that we told each other a version of similar stories. We both talked about a moment, we both talked about a story of kind of a joyous connection with an inspiring parent. And something about the parent's interaction with us kind of set us on our path. Didn't we? Isn't that basically the theme we both independently came up with?
Oh, it's interesting. What does that suggest about this practice, what you just heard them say?
It's very early and very deep.
And what else, that's right, and what else does it suggest?
Brings people together.
Commonality of human experience. You know, it's sort of not at the expense of our particularity at all, but by going through our particularity. See, it's more like you know, you get the transcendent experience of a poem is through its particularity, not through its abstraction. And this is all about particularity, not abstraction, but that's how it gets to transcendence. It's because it brings the experience alive. And so it translates particularity into a vehicle for understanding as opposed to the opposite. And that's been one of the real discoveries for me, working with students from so many different parts of the world. And learning to do this practice. We've been in Japan, we've worked in China, in the Middle East, and the extraordinary capacity of those core human experiences to actually, you know, not in some kind of world peace all of a sudden, but in a very human and real way, establish some kind of experiential common value from which you can begin to build something. It's a good example of that. What else? What other kinds of feedback? What other feedback was most helpful? What did you find? Yeah.
There was a consensus that to look down on this page and see this as the first question was terrifying.
Which?
What is the change you want to make?
Yeah. Well, that's a little. Well, you know, presumably, if somebody's going to exercise leadership, it's about something, right? And presumably, maybe changing something or fixing something, maybe. No, it's good. It's a good question to ask yourself. What did you, besides that, what else did you find most challenging in this exercise? What was hardest? What would you struggle with the most?
Time.
Yeah.
That's speed.
Yeah, the time is, and let me say, the time is quite deliberate. It's really, and at first time people do this 2-minute thing, it's like, oh, I can't possibly. It's amazing that we adapt to that. And what we've learned to do is more images, fewer adjectives. More showing, less telling. More moment, less telling about. And the difference between telling a story and telling about a story. See, when James is sitting in that room and we're in that room with him, he's there with all those boys and he's all alone, we're in a moment with him. As opposed to saying, well, when I was a kid, I experienced loneliness. Or when I was a kid, I was the only one in school, blah, blah, blah. See, telling a story is a moment. Telling about a story is reference to moments. And so the focus, the 2 minutes, is a way of really, really trying to hone down to what's the core here and bring it alive. And people get quite good at it with a little practice. James' whole thing was 5 minutes. Obama does all 3 in 7 minutes. At the beginning, he was a little more loquacious. But, you know. What else? What else did you find challenging? Particularly challenging?
Can I say just a little bit more about, it's scary because we're trained to do the about, not to just go.
I know.
It's like a,
Yeah.
yeah.
But you did it, right?
Oh, yeah. I know.
Yeah. So that's some courage over here. No, I mean, it really, yes, that's right. No, it requires challenging sort of the conventional way we're passive voice and I'm not in it and all that stuff you have to sort of put to one side if you're going to get into the world of motivation. Real motivation in leadership, because it's relational. I mean, and that's what makes it transformational is the relational dimension. This is sort of leadership as an invitation to relationship, as opposed to do this, do that, or if you do this, I'll do this for you. Those kinds of exchange relations, because you're actually taking the time to learn something about what you're about. And that's what creates the potential for growth and change. There was a point over there, yeah.
The first sentence.
Huh?
Deciding what would be the first sentence, I thought was really hard.
Yeah, it's hard.
Just to,
Yeah.
how do you break into it?
So what'd you do?
What she did was terrific. She said, I'm from Arkansas.
All right, there you go.
Someone in this community can say that.
That's great, that's great.
What he did for his first sentence was connect his story to mine.
Ah, very nice. That's really interesting, isn't it? No, it's really interesting. Yeah, the thing is diving in and just starting, and then the good feedback. The good feedback. All right, we're supposed to wrap up, I think, about now, but what are some general takeaways just from this exercise, but also from the whole piece of work that we've been doing this afternoon? Yeah.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
So I think quite often our students and us spend so much time refining, building a cerebral and intellectual picture of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that character.
Mm-hmm.
It's the character that raises the hand in class. It's the character that responds. It's all from a cerebral basis because we're intellectuals after all. What you're speaking to is the heart and trying to connect the two, but also speaking from the heart. Many, I would argue, are potentially very uncomfortable with that.
Yes.
They're uncomfortable with that degree of sharing, and they may never have had that sort of reflective process that may bring out important drivers for who they are cerebrally as intellectuals, but it could also bring out negative things as well.
Yeah.
And I know that in leadership training, this is often an issue. What comes out may not always be constructive.
Yeah.
So how do you balance that?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is that discomfort, in my experience, is usually a sign that there's a lot to be learned. I mean, in other words, I've never used comfort as a standard by which to judge what to do or not do. In fact, in this kind of work, when I hear somebody sort of skip over something, I say, ooh, I got to go back. No, because there's something there. There's something really there. And so that's, yeah, but I mean, that's where the learning is. It's like, and see, this little chart over here is not meant to say heart to the, it's not heart over head, but it's trying to bring them into relationship to one another so the head work can really be done in a powerful and motivated way. See, it's not, but you're right. Of course, there's fears, there's all sorts of stuff that goes into that, and the only way I've ever found to get through that is to get through it. I mean, when we work in other, so my teaching fellows are all former students, and they're coaching, and they run sections, and they coach people, and they evaluate their work, and so they've got living models, evidence of this thing. When we work in other cultural settings, we train coaches from that, like say in Japan, people who learn this practice, and then everything's conducted in Japanese. And there are some cultural challenges there. There might not be in other places, but what's remarkable to me is those cultural stereotypes kind of melt away, because there is a desire to know and to be known. And if it's safe and the conditions are created, it unleashes enormous energy, creative energy. And I find the intellectual work, the strategic work that gets done is so enriched when that's what you're working with, as opposed to when everything's shut down and just tempered and like that. It's when I'm doing my dissertation on strategy, and I found I could understand much more about the sources of good strategizing based on creativity theory, the kind of work Teresa Amabile has done on creativity in organizations, than on analytics. Because inspiration really matters in this stuff. The way we do this in class, we establish norms. We establish, or some people prefer community understandings, or community agreements, I guess is the current term. But norms, about Vegas rules, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, about respect, about step up, step back, the things that help define the space as a space in which certain kinds of behaviors are acceptable and others would not be acceptable because they'd be disrespectful. And so that helps too. But yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about context? Because this is, to some extent, if you're preaching to the converted that you're trying to motivate, it's a lot easier than if you're trying to persuade people with a very different point of view. So James standing up there outside of the Ed School, the only people who are congregating there probably are people who are interested in listening to him. So now teletransport him down to Birmingham, Alabama, and Kansas, or any number of places, and the we is part of the context, but do you talk at all about the...
See, I guess one of the things, yes, clearly you got to know where you are and who you're with, but we focus on what we call an experiential us as opposed to a categorical us. We're used to categorical us's. You're in this, you're not in that. It's zero sum. And the experiential us is a sense of shared experience or shared value. That's where we're getting a lot of purchase out of this sort of thing. Actually, James' video I've shown in a lot of different cultural contexts where, we used it in a training at the mosque in Roxbury, where half the participants were covered. It was okay. We weren't trying to convert anybody to James's way, but there's a basic humanity that comes through, which is where the power of this is. And so, no, clearly it's not going to trump everything and all that sort of thing, but it's a way to get underneath some of those categories into the experiential foundation from which you can sort of build a fresh take on things. That's what's been really interesting. Yeah?
So one of the things we know from psychology, that you know from psychology, is that humans are incredibly good at coming up with stories to explain why it is they do things, even when the real reasons are completely random. So I guess my question for you is, what role does that sort of accuracy of the description play? Is that an important part of this, or is that sort of vital to the exercise?
I think the goal is authenticity, and in other words, to communicate authentic value, authentic meaning, and sometimes I think we confuse intentionality with manipulation. I think that's not, in other words, I think this stuff's really important and it's worth mastering the tools to bring as much intentionality to it as possible. Now, can you fake it? Probably, if you really, really want to fake it. Sort of defeats the purpose. I just had a student from India who sort of said, somebody said, this is how you can put a package on from the outside. She said, no, this isn't about how to apply a gloss from the outside, it's how to bring out the glow from the inside. So in other words, but people use stuff for whatever they use it. But this is an effort to try to enable, how can I put it, to give authenticity the best chance it has of actually doing some real work. The person might not use it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not so concerned with the faking part.
Yeah.
Just the stories that we tell ourselves may or may not
Authentically wrong.
Yeah, it may be authentically wrong. They may be inaccurate descriptions of why we do the things we do.
What you're trying to do here, though, is find something that communicates meaning, right? You know, it's like our Bible story is true. Well, you can get into a whole big discussion. It'd be very, very powerful. But now here you're drawing on your own life experience, your own repertoire of stories. And yeah, sometimes we misremember things, but the idea is to try to do the work to get something real. And the best, what I've observed is the more real it is, the more powerful it tends to be. Especially when you learn how to bring that reality out through some of these techniques and tools that help communicate the power of it. But yeah, no, I take the point.
If I understand the question correctly, I think that a therapist, for example, would respond to that by saying that, you know, if you try and explain, like, I don't know if I developed this phobia or this anxiety disorder because of that particular incident, but you tell that particular incident. So the therapist would say, it doesn't matter because you're telling that particular incident. So as long as you're telling it, as long as you think that it's relevant, then it is relevant.
I do want to distinguish between therapy and what this is. No, because somebody says, oh, this is therapy. I say, no, in therapy you're looking for, with all due respect, for sources of dysfunction, and here we're looking for sources of function. In other words, we're trying to identify value sources. And, but no, I take the point. Yeah, are we time? Okay, yeah.
Today's students, I think, grow up hearing a lot fewer stories from grandparents than people did 50 years ago because they're glued to their electronic gizmos. And does that change the effectiveness of this?
I don't know. I haven't run into those folks yet.
They're coming, they're coming, they're coming.
No, but I mean, even among my undergrads, people draw stories from lots and lots of places. And, you know, parents really matter. Grandparents matter. Sometimes one grandparent, an aunt, sometimes some adult that you know that they have to work to recover, a teacher. Moms, big deal. We do work with something called the Latino Leadership Initiative, which is college juniors, rising seniors from about 8 colleges of dominantly Latino students. And a lot of the kids are first generation college parents or immigrants themselves, their parents grew up in some pretty tough circumstances and often with dads not around. And the first thing is finding the courage to share those stories with each other is a big deal, because they've been told they're supposed to cover up and be perfect and act like the perfect person. And when they realize that what they thought was stigma is actually a pathway to credibility and standing is a big deal. And then when you sort of say, well, where'd the hope come from? And that's where the session we had in Laredo, Texas this summer. Moms. It was amazing. You know, well, my mom, she worked this much and she was working 3 jobs and she's the one that believed in me. And so, you know, with all due respect to the internet and all the rest of it, the human relations still really matter a hell of a lot. At least that's what I see in these stories. Yeah, last.
No, I was watching the FDR thing that's been on NPR about his history, his narrative. And what I find interesting about that connects with what you're doing is when he got polio, at first he tried to totally cover it up, and also he didn't connect very well with people. And then he bought this spa kind of place, and he went there, and all of a sudden he would just be sitting out there and letting his legs, which were quite shriveled, you know, be seen now in that setting. And he was connecting to people, and at least the narrative on this program was that by him being able to connect with other people and see other people, he was able to become at peace with his vulnerability and his weakness, but become a stronger leader. How much he brought in his own self, but about being able to connect with people who were more down and out and all that, and create more of that us.
Yeah, I've heard that even though he covered it up in his public speeches, but what I've heard a lot of people write about is he learned empathy. He had to have the suffering in order to be able to get it.
And to create that us, peace and drive to action and the hope. Because he had been very discouraged, and then when he did this, I guess he got his hope. So it's sort of interesting, since we regard him as one of the greatest, or some leaders in America at a time, as you're saying, of crisis, and lack of hope, how he was able to bring hope to that situation.
And I think the important other point just to draw from that is that often we think hope is somewhere out there, and it's not. It happens to be here, in here, because otherwise we wouldn't be standing here doing what we're doing. We've all got these repertoires. We have this experience from which we can draw and learn and teach and enable others in this way. So thanks very much for your time and the opportunity to work with you. Yeah. Thank you.